So like, listen, there's literally nothing wrong with you. There are other women who've had FGM like you have. I'm one of those women. And then for the first time ever told somebody about my own experience of FGM, and I had no idea the mic was on.
Wow.
Just told the whole room. So that was basically when I decided, fine, if everybody knows that I've had FGM, let me talk about it. I ended up working in terms of my activism within the institutional level, because it was very much institutions that I felt really let down by.
Welcome to How You Find Your Voice, the podcast that asks brilliant women how they found their voice on and off the page.
Shame is really important. The reason that we have Trump, Nigel Farage, all these things is because the lack of shame. It's like they're not embarrassed, but corruption or racism, sexism, misogyny, that should be embarrassing.
I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it. And if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello, and welcome to How You Find Your Voice. My guest today is the feminist campaigner, author, and global women's rights activist Nimco Ali. Born in Somaliland and raised in the UK after arriving as a refugee, Nimco spent nearly 2 decades campaigning to end female genital mutilation and violence against women and girls. She co-founded the HYFYV Foundation, the global partnership to end FGM, and was awarded an OBE for services to women and girls. She's become one of Britain's most influential voices on women's rights. In this conversation, we talk about growing up after experiencing FGM as a child, why silence protects harmful systems, and how asking one simple question, why, shaped her life and her activism. We also explore the role of humour in difficult conversations, the power of speaking openly about our bodies, and why breaking taboos can be one of the most powerful ways of finding your voice. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Nimco Ali OBE, feminist, activist, author, and chief fanny defender. Thank you very much for joining me on How You Find Your Voice. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Hot, but good.
Yeah. And how is Aisha doing?
My vagina, yeah, she's doing quite well. I'm actually kind of celibate at the moment.
Are you?
Yeah, I think it's just like I've not dated in that kind of way, but she's doing very well. I think she's having a break.
She's having a break.
If you're allowed to say that, yeah.
She's on strike. It sounds like a bit of a glib question, but I actually think it's really profound the way that you named your fanny as like Aisha as a sort of reclamation. It is quite funny as well. And I think that's part of your magic. A lot of your activism and the way you've been so effective is this combination of speaking straight, but also being really funny with it. It's quite disarming. When did you first discover that humour was an effective tool for you?
I think it comes from the fact that I do a lot of serious things. I was a very serious child. And then I realized I couldn't necessarily be talking about really morbid and serious things when you're younger. So you just had to make jokes with it. And then I ended up finding myself talking more to adults than children because of the topics that I was interested in. Because I think from the beginning of seeing civil war as a 6-year-old and then having FGM as a 7-year-old and then coming back to this country, the UK, as a refugee. That was a lot of things that were going on. And in order for me to have those questions answered, I needed to go to people that were older than me. So I think making them laugh as I was asking serious questions kind of meant that they weren't just seeing me as an irritating child. They could kind of give me the answers. So I just found it in a way of disarming maybe the seriousness of what I was talking about. And I just kind of carried it on into life.
That's really interesting. So you discovered it at a really young age. You mentioned you experienced a lot as a child. I think the ages of 6 to 7 were very formative. You just touched on that there, that you experienced the thing that you have gone on to campaign against, FGM. I wanted to ask you about the circumstances surrounding it. And how do you think that experience changed or affected your voice and your ability to speak up? Because it sounds like you were still very curious, very kind of questioning and quite vocal. I was just wondering how it impacted you.
It made me very focused on a specific thing. I always say that the premise around FGM is to instill fear into you and to break you down as a woman and then build back the pieces that are only useful to the patriarchy. But what it actually made me do was make me become the loudest person in the room. And one of the things that I consistently ask people is why? Like, why would you do that? And for me, it was the why question that was never answered that kind of led me into this continuous progression into finding my feminist voice, essentially. So yeah, it made me an incredibly curious person about that thing. So I'm never necessarily interested in things that I haven't experienced or seen. So if I see something happen which I think is uncomfortable or what I think is funny, that's how I go and find out more about it. So the personal experience of FGM made me find out more about the issue.
So yeah, it didn't silence you. It's quite the reverse. I find that really interesting because obviously a practice like FGM happens kind of within a culture. And I've heard you say before that it's a kind of a 4,000-year-old practice. I'm really curious to know, why do you think you realised that it was wrong and you refused to take on the cultural viewpoint?
Yeah, I think there was two things. Well, first of all, it was painful. So I think as a child, you answer those questions like, why would you do that? You know, why does something painful happen? And I think we explain to kids when you're immunizing your child or when they're going through a surgery because they need to get better, you were consistently setting context within that conversation. I think, like I always say that my FGM happened out of context because I came from essentially holistically loving family and a family where everything was explained. So this really painful, weird thing happened to me. So I didn't have the context of it being illegal, it being wrong, and all these things at the beginning. I just thought it was very uncomfortable and weird. So when I asked that question, why, and there was no answers for it, that's when I had to step outside my kind of remit of my family. So I wasn't going into this conversation as this is a form of violence against women and girls. It was just like, it's really bizarre. Why did that happen to me? And the silence around it, because I know that my mother and my grandmother and everybody else ultimately felt guilty about it. So they couldn't explain it to me. And they also didn't silence me. So a lot of my other survivors that I've spoken to have talked about it. Like, obviously, yeah, we had a party, we had a celebration, but ultimately that was also part of my life. It wasn't like I wasn't given something extra. I wasn't like a child that was deprived. And then here's this to kind of quiet you down from this weird thing that happened to you. So for me, it was like, where is the explanation to it? There being no explanation to this was ultimately my search for answers kind of led me to where I am.
So it sounds like you were brought up in a kind of progressive family in many ways, and you describe your mom and your grandmother as feminists, and then there was this sort of taboo that they weren't willing to talk about. So that kind of encouraged you to investigate. So on the most part, after something like that happens, after FGM happens, are most girls silenced? Does it work, essentially? And like, how do their lives change?
It does. There's more of a feminine role in terms of, I think it's meant to kind of signify your awakening as a girl and as a woman. And I was very confused by that. I was like, this is really painful because I was the eldest granddaughter and the eldest daughter in the family. And I actually had no idea of my gender and I actually had no idea of being a girl. I knew I had FGM, but I had uncles and cousins who were having circumcision, male circumcision. So I knew something kind of technically happened within the anatomy part of the whole thing. So again, I wasn't conscious of my femininity. I wasn't conscious of my like specific gender. And then after I had the FGM, that wasn't again reiterated. So I wasn't told to close my legs, I'm going to get married, all those things. The FGM happened, but then I was allowed to go back to hang around with my uncle and run around and being very boisterous and very free in some kind of way. But other girls have always were very celebrating of like, this is what it becomes to be a girl. And that's what I found really bizarre. But when I stepped into the space of people that were advocating against FGM, or they thought they were advocating against FGM, they were again really linking it to very traditional roles of womanhood and girlhood. And I was thinking, what is this? What are you talking about? These are not necessarily things that I kind of experienced. And that's when I realized that my experience as a Somali woman was very different to other Somali girls or other girls from different countries, because I was freely educated. There wasn't anything specifically different from any of the men in my family after that.
So that sounds like a really big contributing factor to your ability to kind of see it for what it was and to then speak out about it.
Yeah, and to feel very comfortable to do the research that I did, because I was like, to be a survivor of FGM doesn't necessarily make you an expert. I think my kind of background and the views I have, having worked in advocacy and having worked in policy, is to really understand that broader conversation of what the social contract of a society looks like and where do women and most vulnerable people fit into that. So this is what I say when I tell people that my mother is a feminist. They're like, but you had FGM. But she was 27. She had very little control about whether I was going to have FGM or not, but she had control about the type of FGM I was going to have. So in her mind, getting me semi-medicalized was very important, and then allowing me to be as free as I was. I ultimately realized that she fought very hard for me to be educated as much as I was educated, and to go to the schools that I did, to really free mixed in a society and to really integrate and assimilate into being the British girl that I am. So those are the kind of things that I realized were the things that she had control over. And very much in the work that I do about advocating that we need to empower women, as opposed to this consistent conversation about awareness raising, is very bizarre.
Yeah, like what you're describing there, basically she was within a patriarchal system. You can't completely fight against that. And she did the very best she could within that framework.
I say that my grandmother, so my mother and my grandmother and myself were all kind of very much from the same kind of train in that sense. But if my grandmother was as loud and as kind of confrontational as I was, in her time, she wouldn't have survived. And ultimately, my mother wouldn't be born and I wouldn't be where I am today. So I think it's that way of working within your constraints to push things forward. And it took me a long time to really understand that, because I was, again, judging my mother upon the freedoms that I had in this country as a British girl, saying, oh, why didn't you do this? Not thinking that without actual financial independence and other independence, that you have very little choices over how you raise your girls, let alone who you raise them with.
That's a really chilling point that you made about your grandmother, and also, a really interesting point about your mum and your realization of what she was dealing with or kind of up against. So you experienced this and you came back to the UK from a sort of speaking about it perspective. I understand that you tried to speak to a teacher and it didn't go very well. You tried to kind of find out and you felt slightly let down. In that period of your life, were you able to talk about it to people? What were you looking to understand?
Again, it was the pain. I was very matter of fact about it. In hindsight, you end up putting yourself in the position of the people. I was very much matter of fact, this very, again, precocious 7-year-old came back, said, hi, miss, this happened to me. I, very much my legs were opened apart. I tried to run away from this woman, so on. And it was very much for her. It was like, oh my God, well, that's that's like a bar mitzvah, or that's your coming of age ceremony kind of conversation. And she put it in a context which was very cultural, but it wasn't a culture that I was used to. And I was just thinking, this had nothing to do with me being Somali or me being the child of my dad and my mom. So again, I think I just wanted information in that kind of context, so I would tell her what exactly happened. So I think I was very literal about the conversation. And I can, again, say in hindsight, it must be really weird for a 7-year-old to come back from a trip, tell you that they've been through civil war and this incredibly horrible act happened to them, and you being shocked and seeing how do you console this child without necessarily having that information, and also the kind of foresight to say, well, this is a form of abuse, this is what happened, and all the other kind of things, which ultimately why I ended up working in terms of my activism within the institutional level, because it was institutions that I felt really let down by, because that was when I was 7. By the time I was 10, almost 11, because the FGM I had was so invasive, I ended up having almost kidney failure and I was in hospital. But with that hospital thing is that you physically saw what happened to me. And I think ignoring that was very much, for me, that really irritated me. And I was thinking, but here you are as a medical profession, you can tell me what happened to me, and then not saying anything, but just doing that fake, very British smile. So my grandma always used to say, oh, that's the British smile. It's a bit like the British sun. It's warm, but it's cold. It's bright, but it's cold. And I was okay, which is very much about hiding your deeper kind of senses. So again, I thought that was like very confusing. I don't have as much sympathy for the nurses and the doctors that I do for my poor year 3 teacher that I came back to very kind of, this is what happened to me, miss.
Yeah. So did you feel like you were being dismissed at that time?
I was like, why are you not talking to me? So it was like a level of abandonment in that kind of sense. So that's why I decided after the age of 11 to never really talk about it. Thankfully, having that intervention very early meant that any complications that followed after that were very minimal. Obviously, that scarring is still there. I will always be a woman that lives with the consequence of FGM. But ultimately, the physical consequences were very much limited. So I was like, fine, it's like, I'm going to start my period. I didn't know much about periods at the time, but I was lucky enough to start my period without having any obstructions. I was about to do everything else after that as a woman who had FGM, but got medical intervention very young.
Are you talking about, is it called defibrillation?
Yeah, so it's just like opening up the anatomy to a more natural state in terms of the places that you urinate and menstruate from. So again, it's that whole kind of thing of like, it doesn't matter. I think this conversation around culture consistently being able to explain and excuse weird things is just unacceptable. And I think if we find it weird, that we should say it's weird. It's like, like the cultural relativity of stuff is actually quite harmful to the rights of kids.
That's what you do so effectively. So I'm just wondering how this reversal impacted your voice, because you're saying that what I'm hearing is that you decided not to talk about it, but then it sounds like you're very much getting on with your life and kind of living, I guess, unimpeded. Yeah. So how do you think that affected you? And what was going on with your relationship, maybe with your family or your mother? Were you still on a quest to understand what had happened to you, and how were you going about that?
No, I just thought like, when I had that medical intervention, I was like, okay, fine, that's like, I guess that's the end of it, that nobody wants to really talk about it. It's like, whatever. And I talk about it in the book that I started my period just around the time when I was 15. And my mum was like so excited that my grandmother and all them, like, had a celebratory dinner and all these things, which I didn't understand. I was like, what is going on? Why are we all talking about my period and so on? I guess they thought maybe because I was late when I started, so they were celebrating that. But ultimately, I didn't want to talk about it. But it didn't mean it didn't really impact me, because I ended up like developing an eating disorder. Well, I think I developed an eating disorder very young, at the age of 10, 11. But that was more like I used to consume all my feelings because nobody wanted to talk about it. Right. And then I became bulimic at the age of 14, which that was another way to kind of control my physical body. And that's when this thing of like naming my anatomy. So I think there was a lot of kind of like psychological things that were going on, but the physicality was fine. And my kind of outward look was like, I wasn't a rebellious child. I wasn't any of these things. But also growing up in Cardiff, I was also seeing a lot of things which were quite crazy. So a lot of the kind of South Asian girls, mostly Bangladeshi and some Pakistani girls that I went to primary school work with, were all being taken out of school at year 9 and getting married. So there was a lot of these kind of like weird things that were happening. And I was very much like, why the hell are we not doing anything about it? And saying to a lot of my Somali friends who were all being taken to Manchester and to Dubai to have FGM, I'm like, what are you doing, guys? You can actually object to this. And I remember being about 12 or 13, and there was this girl who was like 16, 17. And when there's like, it's not that much age of a difference now when you're like 40 and then the other person's 43. Yeah. But at 13 and 16, it's a massive age difference. Yeah. And I was like, why are you not going to the police? I was just so confused. I was just like, they can't do this to you, because she knew what was happening to her.
Did she go?
Yeah, she went. And I was like, what? Well, this is what I mean about the kind of the very independent child I was. Like me saying go to the police wasn't like, I wasn't going to get in trouble at home with my mother. She'll just be like, that's Nimco, that's all she does. That's what she does. So I was very much about like, this is weird. And without telling them like I've been through it.
Did you not tell anyone? Did you talk about it?
No, but it was kind of like a given kind of thing that we all kind of had it. I think they kind of assumed. But I was just like, I feel really bad about that, because I was just calling them dumb at the time. I was like, why are you so dumb? Like I would have literally like gone to the police, and then I even said that to.
You were almost like trying to save them you know, from it
Yeah, I
already.
was just very much like, this is not okay, kind of. But also, I went to a different school, so I was very much like, I wasn't like most of my friends at the primary school, the senior schools went Somali and whatever it was, and it was just like really bizarre. And I say bizarre because it was like there was very little advocacy on behalf of those children. And I say that as children. And the reality is that people like the MPs, that all these people knew. And it's not like they didn't know that FGM was happening. It's very interesting compared to what's happening with girls that are, I don't like the term grooming gangs, because then what we're doing is we're actually pigeonholing the sexual abuse of like human trafficking and abuse of girls, because this is a proper conversation about human trafficking of white working class girls. It was the white working class girls and Somali girls and Pakistani girls and Bangladeshi girls, all behind the Labour lens, had no political capital. So they were all just like, oh, we need to think about the community. So by the time I was 16, I was seeing like the girls that I went to primary school with coming back with babies from Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I was just thinking, oh, I'm off to sit my GCSEs. Like, what is actually going on? And I will never forget, there's a girl in my class, she was a twin. And basically, it was meant to be two girls. Basically, her and her sister that was meant to be born were both promised before they were born. But it ended up being a boy and a girl. So when she would stay after school, her brother, and this is when we were like 11, when we would stay after school at primary school, her brother would wait for her because she wasn't allowed to stay out on her own. And I was used to say, like, oh my God, that's really bizarre. But nobody did anything about that. I mean, the teachers knew, and she was very open about her getting married when she's in year 9 and all that kind of stuff.
I guess maybe it's that sort of fear of kind of meddling with people's cultures or causing offence, perhaps.
I know, but it's not Cardiff culture, was it? Sometimes I feel a bit bad about how kind of like quite in my own standpoints of like right and wrong I was. I was a very kind of confident child in what was right and wrong. And obviously those same kids didn't have the same lifestyles that I did. I wasn't scared of being murdered for telling men to fuck off and all this other kind of things. I remember I used to go to Islamic classes, and the guy who was teaching us was a polygamist, and I really hated his daughter. But I didn't hate his daughter. I hated the fact that she used to repeat everything her dad would say about how I was going to go to hell because I wasn't thinking about getting married and all this other kind of stuff. And I was like, your dad is weird with these two wives. I'm like, this is not okay. Like I was actually
with like justice and like you say, what's right and wrong. I'm sort of like so impressed that even at that age, you're such a kind of independent thinker that you could see things as they were.
But then again, I was like that because my mum gave me the leverage to do that. And that's what I mean by I wasn't aware of like how hard she was working. Because I remember that we went to the dentist once and I went to a Catholic school. So I had my uniform and my skirt on. And then this cleric was basically like, ran into me and my mum. And I still remember that because we called the bus together afterwards. And then he looked at her and then talked at my mum and said, if you don't control this girl, then she's never going to get married and she's going to be a disappointment to you. And I just remember thinking, I didn't realize mum is like 20 years older than me. So at that time I was like 13. So she was 33 years old. This 33-year-old woman who basically divorced my dad because he wanted to get a second wife, did all these kind of things, which were incredibly feminist, allowing me to be this loud young woman around town who decided, like, at the age of 14 not to go to Islamic classes anymore because I just hated that guy. I wish I'd found another Islamic class that I could have learned, but it was just the fact that I just couldn't stand this guy telling me that I wasn't going to amount to anything because of the school that I went to and forcing his views down my throat, basically.
And how wrong he was. Who got the last laugh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love hearing that about your mum. It sounds like she's quite a remarkable role model in many ways, and she kind of allowed you to be as free as you could be. I wanted to ask you, you're not talking about it during kind of teenage years, but then you go to uni, Bristol Uni, you're fast-tracked into the civil service and working on sort of policy, like supporting girls who've had FGM at this point.
Public health. It was public health, basically. And then it came across, so there was child protection, all these things. Because again, there was a lot of women that were having babies that were basically presenting with FGM. So we had to have this conversation, and it came across the desk is the fact that they wanted to do something on FGM and this broader conversation. And then I was like, I'm not touching that because I don't want people talking about mutilated, because here I am, educated. I spent most of my adolescence arguing with girls who thought everything was fine and I was the odd one out. So then I was like, I'm not going to have this conversation. So that was part of the policy. And I remember my supervisor at the time inviting somebody down from London to talk about FGM. And I'm just sitting there And then she sees that I'm Somali and she's like, is she allowed in the room? And I was like, what are you talking about? I work here. Anyway, we basically had this conversation and I was just listening and I just kept thinking, but that's not what it's about. It's a form of abuse. And I would always talk about it in the third person, like, third person, third person. And then there was a teacher who was on one of the child protection boards with me. And she says, oh, come to the local academy school. Because everybody used to be confused that I was Somali because I was always so loud and different. And there's like, oh, you Somali was always a thing I used to get. And I was like, yeah, I am Somali and I'm very proud to be Somali. And they said, oh, can you come and talk to a cohort of like, year 9 girls? So they were like 13, 14. I said, okay, fine. I'll come talk to them about universities, aspirations, all that stuff. And then I walked in and because it was a very inner city school and I was very kind of confident as a teenager, but I wasn't boisterous. I wasn't loud as these girls are. So they all walked in and they were all going on about boys and all this stuff. And I was like, you're all too young to be talking about boys. And then the teacher walked out. So there was 14 Somali young girls and me, so 15 Somali girls in that room. And then one of them asked me like, Mrs. FGM halal? And she put it in an Islamic context. And again, there are many things that when I think about, I feel incredibly upset about and the way that I deal with it in hindsight, I wish I was a little bit more tactful. And I said, oh my God, what do you guys know about FGM? Like basically, like it's like 2004 or 2005. I was like, what do you guys know about FGM? Who had FGM? And then I said, put your hands up if you've had FGM. It was really like that is not how you deal with a child protection issue. But there I was like 22 years old. I was very just kind of like just thrown in. I was actually incredibly triggered, I think, but I didn't know I was triggered at the time. And then I said, put your hands up. And then 13 out of the 14 girls put their hands up. And they all kind of like really regressed. And it was really funny because one of them, who's very much like me, because she was like really tall for her age, quite chubby. And I looked at her, I was like, you look so much like me when I was like, when I was like 13, 14. She basically snaps out of it and says to the one girl that wasn't cut. And I still remember that scene like playing because the other girl was like really tiny, had like this beautiful gap in her teeth, had this little black headscarf on. And this girl just goes like, don't think you're special. Listen, they're going to take you back to Somaliland this summer. They're going to open. So she basically vividly described her FGM to this other one. And I was just like, no, stop. And then the teacher walks in. Oh my God. And then everyone just flips.
In what way did they flip?
They basically just became little Bristolian girls again. It was like the FGM or nothing was just like there. And I was like, oh, okay, that was just like bizarre. And then there was a suggestion box in the middle that we were going to answer questions about. And then the teacher started bringing out the questions. And I was like, oh my God, hopefully FGM doesn't come out. But they were like really like out there. They were like anal sex. And I was like, guys, we don't need to be talking about it. So anyway, every single question in that suggestion box, because they knew the teacher was going to be in that room, was nothing to do with FGM. So then I went back to my office and I was like, oh, we need to do something about FGM and young people. And that's where basically the whole Bristol stuff started off.
Well, it sounds like that was a really pivotal moment for you.
It was, but I still didn't want to talk about me as a survivor of FGM because, again, the conversation kept on consistently being about victims. And I was like, fuck you, I'm not a victim.
Yeah, you didn't like be defined by that.
Yeah, like, what victim are you talking to kind of thing. So that was kind of like the beginning of the conversation. And then, obviously, I came to London and I did my transfer for work and I was doing some counterterrorism work, but I really wanted to stay in the FGM space. So I ended up volunteering for an organization that was working with FGM survivors. And there was a young girl, again, this incredibly amazing young woman who I still see on Facebook. And it's just weird how kind of our world kind of entwined into a different way. But she basically had been sectioned into the mental health act because she had a breakdown because the boy she was about to marry rejected her because she had FGM, and she'd kind of like normalized her FGM as this, it's going to make me a woman, I'm going to get married, all that stuff. So then she came and she was doing an art project and she said to me, oh, I'm going to do this event in East London. Do you want to come? And I said, I had a date. So I took my date to the event. And then I remember getting there and then everybody going, where is she? Where is she? Where is she? And I was like, what do you mean, where is she? Like, have you not checked on her? And then she walked in and then this girl drags her and puts her on the stage, like, because she was meant to be speaking about her artwork at this fundraiser event. And she started like hyperventilating. And I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm so complicit to her feeling so alone. So I went up to her. I said, like, listen, there's literally nothing wrong with you. You know, there are other women who've had FGM like you have. I'm one of those women. And then for the first time ever told somebody about my own experience of FGM. And I had no idea the mic was on.
Wow.
just told the whole room. So that was basically when I decided, fine, if everybody knows that I've had FGM, let me talk about it. But I was very insistent on not talking about the victim, not talking about my experience of FGM, just really saying that there are things that we can do that ultimately ends FGM, because they used to have these conversations about eradicating FGM. And I'm like, but it's not a virus. There's like active steps that you have to take in order for it to actually be enacted.
Yeah. What you just described there, that moment of deciding to break the silence and show solidarity with this other woman. How did it feel, that moment when you realised that you just kind of accidentally announced it to this whole event?
It was really weird. My date's face was the picture. It was like,
yeah.
And then it's really funny because he and I went for dinner afterwards, and he's like, but you don't remember it, do you? You don't want to. And it's just like, he was very much like, I don't know how to ask these questions. And I think that was very respectful of him, because many years later, everybody was very much interested and very open about asking about my anatomy. Like even when we tried to do the NHS data and stuff, and like, Jeremy Hunt's first question was, can women like you have an orgasm? And I was like,
did you really ask that?
Yeah.
That's quite outrageous.
It's like, but that's what everybody assumes. And I was just like, again, coming back to that comedy thing, I'm like, well, it depends on how good you are in bed, Jeremy, but we're not about to have sex. So, and that's the main thing. It's like that kind of misconception about women who've had FGM not being able to have orgasms is ultimately because a lot of the women have to marry or are dating men from their communities who are forcibly married to. So it's like the level of intimacy and the level of like, choice of who they're having sex with. I tell girls that there's one of my friends who, when I told her that, because she was married a few times, and I said, but you didn't choose to be married to these men. And then anyway, I told her, I said, but this is how you have an orgasm, whatever. She was meant to come back for lesson 2. Lesson 2 was like, don't confuse an orgasm for love. Like, there are people that are good in bed, but they're not good for you. That's what you've got to say. Like, that's why the Asha has to be separate to Nimco. But she didn't come back for lesson 2. I said to her, like, you had to come back for the second lesson, which was not to confuse an orgasm with love.
And what happened to her? Why did she not come back for the She got married?
Because she got so excited. She got married to the first person who gave her her first orgasm. I was like, that's not what you're meant to do. You're not meant to like...
Yeah.
That's not how it works. You let them go, you thank them, and then you move on.
So at this point in your life, you have moved from kind of working in the area, like policy and health, and moving into kind of the more publicly owning, I guess, your story.
Yeah.
What was that period of your life like? I'm just thinking in terms of how are you feeling at this point and how empowered to speak? Because that's quite like a step change. I'm assuming it wasn't all just like, it's a moment and now I'm emboldened and I can talk about it. You're not how you are now. I'm sure it must have taken a process to get to where you are.
100%, because I was very keen on not connecting the FGM to me, but it was very much connected to me. And it was very much something like that happened to me rather than something that defines me. And that's why if you see my name online, there's the Nimco with a K and the Nimco with a C. And I was like, the C is my legal name. That's how I've got my degrees. That's who I am. But again, it was very much like everybody wanted to talk about the act of FGM as opposed to something we can do about it. And the reality is, again, people were confusing my experience of physically with FGM with my policy and my, actual work and what it takes to be an advocate and activist. I wasn't complaining about FGM. I was campaigning to do something about it. Very little of that was taken seriously. And I was very much like, talk about your experience, talk about the horror. And I was like, I don't want to talk about the horror. It happened to me. It's not something that's happening right now. I remember taking a picture once with an MP and they were like, oh, should we be smiling? I'm like, why not? Like, I'm not literally being mutilated as we speak. But again, at the same time, I was also getting pushback from the gatekeepers. So most people on the left were very much like, oh, you're stigmatizing the community, you're doing this. And I'm like, fucking hell, like they're mutilating their children. It's like, what is wrong with you? If you can't stigmatize that. One thing I really hate is this idea of the fact that we go into these conversations with a non-judgmental approach. I'm like, if something is wrong, we have to start off saying it's wrong. We don't go in with a very like, this is your culture. It's like saying this is a form of abuse. It's like we have child abuse here in the UK. We have murder. We have rape. Like no society has actually created a utopia for women yet. So it was really bizarre just getting that complete pushback from people. And I ended up finding my community and my tribe in very posh men who went to private school. They went to very elite but terrible schools. So we both had trauma at the same time. Trauma that was told to define us as children that was going to be good for us, but we knew was wrong. So things that came from a position of not harm, but really did a lot of harm to us. So a lot of Etonians and a lot of people that there's been three incredible people that have kind of supported my work. One has been very much the conservative men, and then other conservative men who've been in the army and have seen children in Afghanistan and Sierra Leone and other places, and have kind of come back and said, I couldn't speak as an army general or the head of army or whatever, but I can speak now, so can I stand with you? And then secondly was a lot of like Jewish professionals who came in and said, I want to be able to help because this is like, I care about children. But I think that very white, privileged male conversation is very misunderstood because they've been told the reason why you're a lawyer or all these things is because you went to boarding school, not because they did the work afterwards. So they had a very traumatic experience at 7, and I had the same experience. So we both had warped sense of family and duty, and they were fighting against something. Most of them were like, I have to send my kids to boarding school. That was good for me. I was like, was it good for you? Which is not dissimilar to women believing that FGM made them the mothers and the women that they were.
It's like a generational thing. It's the done thing. It's our culture. It's what our family do. And so then you just repeat it because you feel that it's your duty.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't understand how me and all these men got involved. I'm like, no, we all had broken wings at the age of 7.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It's also interesting what you just said earlier about people kind of being cautious to kind of name it as child abuse, because obviously like FGM's been illegal, hasn't it, since like the 1980s or something?
Yeah, 83. But that was more like a plaster thing of like, oh, you can't do FGM here. But then they were taking the girls out of the country, like those 16, 17-year-olds that were in Cardiff. But the whole point is like GBH has been illegal. It's like you can also define it as a form of torture. So there are many legal things on it, but we consistently want to put a culture lens on it. So it was like, you're expecting me to be British, pay taxes, but yet at the same time, when it comes to my protection, it's like I'm being othered.
Yes.
And it's very similar to, I've been talking a lot about witchcraft at the moment and children and all these things that are increasing in the UK. But the reality around that is about mental health.
Could you explain? I don't really know much about this.
So basically, Victoria Columbier is the most prominent case of witchcraft where you believe a child is possessed and therefore there's like exorcisms and things that happen on children. And there's been a high increase in the number, especially in London and other places where West African communities are prominent. And then somebody called me and they were like, they thought I was going to say, yes, these terrible cultures. And I was like, well, I said, it's about a mental health thing. I said, at the point that you think the child is possessed, then you are in acute psychosis. And we need to be talking about mental health crisis within African communities as opposed to, so people end up forgetting, like, they're thinking, what is the policy answer to this? As opposed to like, oh, how do we talk to the community to not beat witches out of their children?
How do we help these people? It's not...
Exactly. And sometimes you've got to say some things are not conducive to the culture of this country, and you just don't do that. So I think that's another thing, because once we ignore it, then what happens is we create space for people like Nigel Farage and all these other people who are creating crises. So I think cultural relativism is actually allowing people not to ensure that they're able to protect children and so on.
And yeah, what you're describing there is like allowing people to speak up, or a lot of your work is all about, yes, just like raising the lid on silence, essentially, so that you can get things out on the table and discuss it. I want to talk about oversharing, because we first met when you came and did an event in Bristol at 5x15, and your talk was, there's no such thing as oversharing. And what I remember is how funny and effective and galvanizing it was. And obviously that whole idea went into your book, What We're Told Not to Talk About, but we're going to anyway. Why do you think oversharing is so important?
It's about breaking taboos, and it's about breaking this concept of shame. And I think, I forget her name, but the French lady that was like, that said that shame needs to change signs. Because I do actually think that shame has an incredible positive role in society, because the whole point is that we should be embarrassed on shitting on the public pathways. Shame is really important because, like, for example, like our politicians, unless they have shame, they will do shameless things. It's like the reason that we have Trump, Nigel Farage, all these things is because the lack of shame. It's like they're not embarrassed, but those are the things like corruption or racism, sexism, misogyny, that should be embarrassing, as opposed to you being embarrassed about being raped, you being embarrassed about being abused. So the whole point of the power of shame, I do believe it has a role in culture. But in my culture, there's basically the woman that speaks is the woman with no shame, but is in a way of saying, my God, do you not have any shame? Why are you talking about your anatomy like this. And I'm like, of course I don't have any shame. Why am I embarrassed by something that you should be embarrassed about? Like, I'm currently being trolled by a person on social media, but him and his other Somali men that support him, but they keep using this picture of me dressed as a vagina to try to shame me. But dude, I put this picture out there.
Yeah.
This is how moronic that you are, that you're actually saying that I should be shamed about being dressed like this, as opposed to you guys doing what you do. I was at a dinner in Somaliland recently and I was telling a senior politician about the work that I do. And then he started saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't do like the most invasive form of FGM, but we should do this. And he's very like explicit about talking about the anatomy and what should be done. And I'm like,
Oh my
excuse
God.
my language. I'm like, are you fucking sick? And the person next to me was shocked that I was swearing at him.
Good for you.
And then I was like, listen, he's talking about a child's anatomy. I'm like, is he like, he's gross. So that's what I mean about the oversharing, is that that's how you break the silence. It's like calling him out and not being embarrassed to say, actually, he should be embarrassed about talking about a child's anatomy and damaging it, as opposed to me being embarrassed about calling him a dickhead, basically.
Absolutely. Because, yeah, when you point something like that out, it just kind of highlights it, even if this is culturally understood. Like, if we boil it down, it is completely weird. It's more than weird, it's completely horrific.
Yeah, and that's what we have to overshare. It's like, why would you do that? Like, what is this thing? So I think the more we overshare about anatomy and the things that happen to us as women and all these things, it's just like, I think that's where the power comes from, because the power ultimately at the moment against us, or what they're doing to us, the oppression, sits within the silence. And when women talk and say, I don't like that, or that happened to me, then that's how it kind of opens up. And I really realized that when I was doing my role at the Home Office, it was very much about, we talk about public consultations, but very few people were being consulted. And when more and more women spoke up and more women talked about the health strategy and all these things, it's like we find a commonality of like endometriosis, miscarriages. There are so many things that are physically innate to us as women that we're told to be embarrassed about. But when we start talking about it, there's actually a power of liberation in that. So I think that's like, the power of the group chat.
Definitely, which is kind of very much what the basis of your book, which I absolutely loved. And it was just so interesting to hear a lot of voices that you might not usually be able to hear, kind of the universal experiences of periods or orgasms or birth or menopause. I was wondering how you managed to get a lot of the women to share those very intimate things with you. Was it difficult?
I think my greatest skill in life is good chat.
That is a really good
That's
skill.
why everybody's always confused as to how I know people. I'm like, I just had a chat with them, and everybody always has a nickname in life. And it was just like having that conversation with women, because you do have that commonality. And I do say in one of the books, we all have our first experience. And I think that's the equalizer that we all have. It doesn't matter whether you're the richest person in the world or the poorest person. Your first period is your first period. It's like, that is something that is so, like, unique to you. And interesting enough, because I had my infibulation very early, I was able to have all my experiences as a woman who's had FGM but wasn't limited. So I was like, I'm going to have all those experiences as a woman living with the consequence of FGM, and I can never take that away. So yeah, it's just about having these conversations. And I just kind of would have sat around with those women, like, across the world, like some of them living in gilded cages. And it's like, you think that they're having these most amazing experiences. I was talking to somebody last week, and we were talking about the age ranges for politicians in Africa and everything. They said that they're going to raise the age to be a MP to 30, and then to be a president at 40 or 45. And then I said, in the Western world, I don't think anybody under the age of 60 should become like, a leader in terms of a president, because it doesn't matter how your life has gone in life. By the time you're 60, you've been humbled by something.
Yeah.
And I think girls get humbled at a very young age, like your first experience of a period, and not knowing the level of pain because you can't describe it, because nobody's given us a scale. If you go and talk about a toothache, because men have experienced, you get a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. With periods and all these things, you get the uncomfortability range. So I think that conversation, this is going to feel uncomfortable. It's like you give birth, it's agonizing. It's
having a coil fitted or taken out. Or people.
But this is what I
passing
mean.
out.
Yeah, when I had my coil fitted, I almost passed out. And then when somebody started talking about the pain gap and all these conversations and saying that actually it's a bit like having a root canal treatment, especially when you haven't had a baby and your cervix haven't dilated before, it was like so painful. I was sweating so much.
Yeah.
I've never sweated that much in my life. So I just think that there's a lot of silence around our suffering. And if we can kind of talk about it, then it just becomes easier.
Absolutely. But there is, I imagine, a public cost of speaking out. I understand that
100%.
you've had death threats for, was that from within the Somali community? Or was it men and misogyny in general, would you say?
It was within the Somali community. And then it was like the left not understanding, saying basically I was like victim blaming, like the police would say, well, maybe if you just step back and don't talk about things and whatever. And then recently I got sued for what a tweet. But the reality is that now that person is like threatening me in terms of the things that I say. For me being pro-choice, consistently, it is men. It is mostly men. And then I was back in Bristol recently and there was a guy that said to me, oh, I used to really hate you, a grown-ass man. He's like, you could be my father. And I was like, why? And he said, oh, because of all the work they used to do around FGM. And I said, do you know how gross that is? You have to push it back to these people. I didn't have the confidence when I was scared for my life. I was more focused on like, I need to get these legislation passed. But I just said to him, do you know how weird it is that you hated me for saying that you shouldn't mutilate little girls' vaginas? It's like, I don't think I'm the problem, hon. So it was quite painful. And I think, again, I was very dogmatic about things and I didn't take a moment to kind of breathe and listen and see how it was also impacting my mom and other people around me. But I'm like, incredibly grateful that I'm in a place where like I'm still getting a lot of rubbish. I think at the core, I'm still kind of dealing with a lot of the trauma and the people are still out there. But ultimately, I'm definitely a lot more comfortable in my space and in my life.
What kept you going through those dark times and what kept you being courageous enough to speak?
I just knew I was right.
Yeah.
It's really bizarre because I just think like, no, honestly, people have to listen. And even now, it's really funny how people want to be able to deal with their ability not to see things the way that it's very simple. So they have to make me the problem. So you're right wing or and I'm saying, what, how am I right wing? How am I controversial? Like, what have I ever said that's like bizarre? I don't know, like maybe not liking matcha makes me controversial to Gen Z or whatever, but it's really bizarre because my two little cousins are like, one's just finished uni and the other one is just in his second year. He's just going back into his third year. And they both had the Nimco as my cousin experience. Because I tell them, so one of them went to SOAS, where I'm banned from. And then this guy goes to my little cousin. He's like, oh, do you know that crazy like Tory Somali, Nimco Ali? And then my cousin's like, oh, that's my cousin. And they're like, yeah, but what kind of cousin? He's like my cousin. And he's always like, the amount of times when people just like make random stuff about you, like you're the boogie monster to these kind of things. And that used to upset me before, but now I actually don't care to a certain extent because my legacy and what I really want to do is that I want to be able to ensure that girls are safe. And I want to be able to be sure that institutions are set up for the people that they care about.
You've done so much with your voice, with your campaigning. You've achieved so much. You've set up the Daughters of Eve. I mean, you received an OBE. You set up the HYFYV Foundation, which has done just phenomenal work in campaigning against FGM globally. You are one of the most prominent campaigners against FGM and are working towards it not existing by 2030. Where are we with that fight and what still needs to be done to achieve that goal?
I think that what really needs to be done is ultimately at the core of the HYFYV Foundation's work. It's something that I'm incredibly proud of. It's the one thing which I co-founded. It's being run by incredibly amazing African women. It's ultimately about investing in grassroots activism. Like this work, like the first person to even define the terminology of female genital mutilation was a woman from Somaliland called Edna Aden, who basically went and said, this thing is killing us. Let's do something about it. I think the most mistake in that conversation was that we looked at it as a health issue. So we looked at the health consequence of FGM as opposed to the harms and the human rights aspects of it. So I do think that we can end FGM by 2030, but ultimately that means that we need to give credible funding to grassroots organizations, and that's what the HYFYV Foundation does. And if anybody's interested, is that we give 100% of anything raised to the women on the ground. And when we're doing that, we're not just looking at just FGM, but we're looking at all the other forms of gender-based violence around that, because FGM is the most pernicious, but it's also the first principal form of violence against women and girls. I had this problem with the Foreign Office when they're talking about ending sexual violence in conflict. And I was like, well, maybe you should start before the conflict starts, build the rule of law and humanity and capacity for women. Because if there is FGM, child marriage, no access to education, when war breaks out, women are going to be raped, women are going to become the commodity of the conflict. So I'm very, 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 very hopeful that the FGM is going to end by 2030, not because it's going to be magical, but it's the fact that we're going to work with adolescent girls and women who have young children in order to give them the power to be able to make those choices that my mother couldn't make at 27. So if a woman has access to education, access to employment, access to her own money, she decides who she marries, when she marries, and how many kids she has, and how she raises those kids. And I think that's the fundamental thing, is making democracy and capitalism a thing in Africa, because we can't build a continent, we can't build communities and countries on a dependency alone.
Well, I wanted to ask you, if you weren't campaigning so heavily against FGM, what would you be campaigning for? What's your next sort of passion, would you say?
Do you know what? I'm in my anti era. I'm very protective of young Black professionals and people that are in the limelight. So my little cousin is working at Wimbledon at the moment, and for him to be there in a space that he doesn't think he belongs in, and to see so many incredible young Black players. I was going to write a Substack about this, about thinking that I thought racism didn't impact me because I'm like, I don't really care. And then COVID happened, and I realized the consistent microaggressions that I've dealt with all my life and how you overcompensate in those things. Even with the FGM work, it's like, I think FGM would not be where it is today had I not given almost 10 years of my life to it. But solemn, do these people that are in that space ever acknowledge that, or ever acknowledge the work that's been put into it? And I don't really want the credibility, but I think a little bit of the humanity and the respect would be nice. I think those things happen to incredible athletes as well. And I'm very conscious about the fact that people are celebrating the England team as we speak. But if they lose, those young Black players are going to get a lot of pushback. So I think my kind of thing at the moment is just to be that kind of like soft landing for a lot of young people of color, and also young people from working class communities who are in spaces where they think that they don't belong. Because as much as race is an issue, I think class is also an issue in this country. So I think my idea would have been, if I'd probably be in a senior government position, or probably in a big kind of like firm, but always kind of looking out for just having my food with the janitor and all these other kind of people, and just really getting to know. Because I think community is what keeps people going. And we're very, especially in our politics, we're very kind of lacking in community.
Very divisive at the moment.
It's very divisive and it's very unnecessary, because the reality is that you can't talk about immigration without actually being xenophobic.
Trying to find common ground between all of these different factions in society and finding a route forward, perhaps.
Yeah, the route forward is that we all have to give up a little. I'm a heterosexual Black woman who is able-bodied, but ultimately I pay my taxes. I do things for people that need it in this country. I can talk about the government not working for me and so on, but ultimately it doesn't mean that I want everything to work for me. So I think people don't really understand that in order to live in a democracy, in order to live in a fair world, we all have to give a little.
Nimco, we're coming to the end, but I just wanted to ask you a few quick questions that I do ask guests who come on here. The first one is, what advice would you give to a woman trying to find her voice? Maybe she's lacking courage to speak up. What would you say to her?
Write it down first. Trust your gut. I always say your gut is ultimately your ancestors trying to tell you that you're on the right path. So I think trusting your gut is the key things. If you feel it again and again, if it keeps coming back to you, then it's the truth.
That's good advice. What keeps you hopeful?
I think it's like kids that I see in my family. I think it's like kids that can still laugh at things that are terrible in this world. I think there's a lot of really bitter older men, but seeing young people who are very humorous, I think that's what keeps me going. I think seeing the sarcasm pass to the next generation is hilarious.
Who's your favourite female writer of all time?
I think Chimamanda is somebody that I think she listens to her voice, listens to what is at her core. I've been listening to a lot of bell hooks recently as well in terms of her writing, in terms of female voices that really kind of help me at my core as well. I think Noelle Adesalawi was incredible in terms of actually articulating FGM for what it was.
Yeah, she's amazing. Who's your favourite gobby opinionated woman, other than yourself?
Yeah, but you know what? I'm not even that opinionated. It's really
not.
funny because people, you say to me like, oh, you're really argumentative. Then I realize that they're arguing with me about things that I care about. I'm like, you're not arguing with me about football. You're arguing about women's rights.
Yeah, you're not just arguing for you're seeking justice and understanding.
Yeah. So I think my niece is my favorite, but it's just like seeing young girls when they're very young saying no. I'm incredibly proud of that. I said to one of my friends is asking me about, she's got a dual heritage daughter, and she's saying to me, I want her to be respectful, but how do I also get her to stand in her own mind? I said, when she says she doesn't like anything, don't force her into it unless it's food or whatever. If she doesn't like something, and also don't say to her, you can't wear pink. If she chooses to be a pink girl, let her be a pink girl. So I think toddlers are my favorite people. I think toddlers ultimately know what they're talking about. I think I'm a toddler at heart because I call a lot of things disgusting, and they're the only people that say that's disgusting. So my niece and my little goddaughters, I think, are my most gobbiest women.
Love it. And finally, what's the hill you'll die on?
What's the hill I die on? I think the fact that it's not culture if it harms women. Culture is not harmful. Yeah, I think that's the hill I will die on.
Thank you, Nimco Ali, so much for your time. Thank you for talking to me. It's been fascinating. Nimco is such a powerhouse, and what she's achieved in the fight to end FGM is extraordinary. It strikes me that why is the question that shaped her life. Why would you do that? Why did that happen to me? Why is this accepted? It was the fact that nobody could answer these questions that ultimately led her to find her feminist voice. Nimco clearly has a very strong sense of what she believes is right and wrong, and once she's arrived there, she won't back down. Even when speaking out has brought trolling, death threats, and years of hostility, she's kept going because she believes the cause is bigger than the cost. And she does it all with humour. As she says, her gift is good chat, which she uses to disarm, to open dialogue, and to bring people with her. I suspect that's one of the reasons she's been such an effective campaigner. I love talking to Nimco, and I hope you enjoyed listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do follow the podcast, leave a review, or share it with someone who loves storytelling or complicated women. It really helps an independent podcast like this one. And if you'd like more conversations like this, along with behind-the-scenes reflections and thoughts on books, creativity, and voice, you can join the How You Find Your Voice Substack. It's a new space to go a little deeper into the ideas, books, and conversations that sit behind this project. I'd love to see you there. The link's in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Until next time.